for, this has been, I guess, this is the 9th week maybe that we have been going through the book of Esther. And when you look at the book of Esther, prior to this chapter, it looks like everything is lost. It looks like the people of Jewish descent in the Persian Empire are all going to be destroyed. It looks like that Haman is going to win in his evil plot. Yet at the end of chapter 7, we saw how when Esther rose up, when Esther spoke truth, when Esther courageously went to the king and shared her heart, that the king saw what was happening. And that changed everything when Esther courageously went to the king. And what's amazing is if you look back at King Ahasuerus or King Xerxes, whatever your translation calls him, at the beginning we see that he is a very hard-hearted king. He is one who, when he says something, it doesn't change. And so it looks like that, it's pretty dark. But yet, in this chapter, God begins to flood in with his light. The first verse of chapter 8 says, "On that day, King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had disclosed what he was to her." Esther had told the king that Mordecai was her uncle, that Mordecai was her caregiver. And so Mordecai came before the king. And when you look at that and you see how the king had given Haman's estate, Haman's property to Esther, you see a king who is not greedy in this picture, because under the Persian law, if a king had put someone to death, they had the rights to their property. They could take that and add that to their properties, and that just made them richer. But here's a king whose heart is softened. Here's a king who has seen the evil, and his heart is softened, and he, instead of keeping all of Haman's riches and properties for himself, he gives them to Queen Esther. And then, because when you look at the life of the king, how do we know that he had a hard heart? What did he do to his first wife? Yeah, when she wouldn't come dance before them, he said, "You're out. I'm divorcing you, you're gone." He was also the one who promoted Haman. He had evil people in his cabinet, and he promoted them, even though he didn't know that Esther was a Jew, but he knew that Haman said, "Hey, there's this group of people who are pretty strong, and we need to get rid of them." And he said, "Do what you need to do to get rid of them." He had a hard heart. He didn't care. So he was willing to eradicate all of the Jewish people. He was the one who knew that whatever laws were passed were permanent. They could never be changed. He didn't care about that. He could thumbs up, people lived; thumbs down, people died. He just had that kind of power. But when you look at him here at the end of chapter 7 and the beginning of chapter 8, you see someone whose heart is not quite so hard. You see someone whose heart is changed. And and why is that? Why is it when Esther went to him, when it could have cost her her life, why do you think that he held a scepter out and he asked her, "What do you need?" Why was his heart changed? Because of the fasting and the praying of the people. And it was just the sovereign hand of God. God moves in people's hearts and in their lives. And so God softened his heart so that he could hear Esther's plea, and so that he would be able to see for his own self how evil Haman was. And he impaled Haman himself upon the gallows that Haman had built. And now, at this point, he had given Haman's entire estate to Esther. And not only did he do that, but in verses 2 and 3, it says, "The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken away from Haman, and he gave it to Mordecai." That means that he elevated Mordecai to be the second in power in the Persian kingdom. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet as she wept and implored him to avert the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite and his plot that he had devised against the Jews. You see, when you look at what was happening here, you realize that even though the king's heart had been changed, even though the king now was sorry for what had happened and he had gotten rid of Haman, verse number 3 says, that Esther fell at the king's feet and wept and begged him to stop Haman's evil plan. Haman was gone, but the law was still in effect. The Jewish people were all still slated to be killed and eradicated. Because the Medo-Persian laws, once they went into effect, once the king's ring was stamped into that law, it could never be changed. It stood forever. And so Haman was gone, but the law was not. And Esther knew that something had to be done. And in the 5th verse, Esther says, if it pleases the king, if I have found favor before him, and the matter seems proper to the king, and I am pleasing in his sight, let it be written to revoke or to rescind or to change the letters that were devised by Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who were in all the king's provinces. She said, let it be written. But it was already written. It was already done. It was already there. And we live in a culture where we can change laws. When a different politician comes into office, what do? They just turn around all the laws that the last administration put into place. But that couldn't happen there. It was unheard of in the Persian land. And Esther goes on and says in the 6th verse, for how can I endure to see the calamity which shall befall my people, and how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? And when you look at this situation, you see, is this too hard? How can this be turned around? But we realize that nothing is too hard for God. Because in verses 7 and 8, it says, the king said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given the house of Haman to Esther, and him they have hanged on the gallows because he had stretched out his hands against the Jews. Now you write to the Jews as you see fit, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For a decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring may not be revoked. Basically, the king told Mordecai and Esther, here's the pen, you write a new law, you seal it with my ring, and it's going to override the old law. And that's pretty amazing that this king who was so hard-hearted in the beginning, this king who always had to have his way and never backed up, he told them how to get around what was getting ready to take place. So in verses 9 and 10, it says, so the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, on the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces, which extended from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to every province according to its script, and to every people according to their language, as well as to the Jews according to their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, and he sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horses riding on steeds, sired by the royal studs. So the message is going out with the authority of the king. It was carried by the king's soldiers on the king's horses, saying, this is the new law. In verses 11 through 13, in them the king granted the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and defend themselves, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the 13th day of the 12th month. A copy of the edict to be issued as law in each and every province was published to all the peoples, so that the Jews should be ready for this day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So even though the law of the Medes and the Persians could not be changed, the law that Haman had written was going to stay on the books. It was going to be there forever, that the Jewish people were to be killed on that 13th day of that month. But the king heard Esther's pleas, and he told her and provided a way that the law could never come into effect, or at least it could be neutralized. He gave the Jews the right to protect themselves. He gave the Jews the ability. If any people on that 13th day of the 12th month rose up and tried to kill any Jewish person, every Jew had the right to kill them, to defend themselves. And so that way, when this new law went out, it was written in every language of every people that was in the 127 provinces. It was posted everywhere, so everybody could see there were two laws in place that day. One is, yep, you can kill the Jews. But the second one was, the king now says, if you try to kill the Jews, they can kill you. And nothing's going to happen. Nobody's going to be worried about if a Jew tries to kill somebody else. They were able to defend themselves. So in the 14th verse, it says, the couriers hastened by the king's command. They went out riding on the royal steeds, and the decree was given out in Susa, the capital. And so this is pretty amazing that they figured out a way to neutralize the first law. Do you think that was an accident? Do you think they're just so smart that they're able to do that? No, it comes back to the sovereign hand of God again. Even when it looks dark, even when it looks like it's impossible, God moves his hand. And God touches the hearts of people that need to be touched. And he's able to turn things around for his people. And so, when you look at, I was going to see where, if verses 15 through 17, it's interesting because I'm sure that the Jews probably thought, as that 13th day of the 12th month got closer, they probably were a little jumpy. You know, even though the second law had been written, even though they had been told, if someone tries to kill you, it's okay if you defend yourself. But I'm sure that in the back of their mind, they wondered, am I going to have to defend myself? Are there people who are going to rise up? Are there people going to try to kill my children, and I'm going to have to try to fight them off? And so I would think that there probably was a heaviness that was over the Persian Empire. Even though the Jews were excited that this new law had come into effect, there had to be some tension there. There had to be some stress there in that situation. And in verses 15 through 17, it says, then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a large crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And here is a Jew who's come out dressed in the royal robes. Here is a Jew who's coming out to stand in front of all the Jewish nation and to say, look at me, I am a part of the king's court. I am now a ruling official in the king's kingdom. And when the Jewish people saw Mordecai dressed up, when they saw Mordecai in a position of power, that gave them hope, that gave them joy. And it says that the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced, for the Jews there were light and gladness and joy and honor. And in each and every province and in each and every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews. There was a feast and there was a holiday. And many among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. Even though it seemed dark, even though it seemed impossible, the darkness is not impossible for the light of God to penetrate. And sometimes we can live in a place of gloom. Sometimes we can live in a place of darkness. Sometimes we can live in a place where it just seems like day after day there is heaviness. And it seems like we just can't push through it. And we have to be in the Word of God. We have to be praying. We have to always be looking for the goodness of God everywhere that we're at. And when we see the goodness of God, just like the Jews saw the goodness of God and seeing Mordecai coming out as an official in that foreign government, when the Jews just months earlier had been decreed to be all eradicated, and now there's a Jew at second in command, there was the goodness of God. There was light that was shining out of the darkness. That's the same way in our life. When we're in that darkness, when we're in those hard places, we need to look for the goodness of God. We need to look for the light of God that shines out, that makes a difference where we are at. And Esther's story is really not just an old story in the Old Testament. It's a story that is relevant to us today. It's a story about the same kind of things that happen to us wherever we're at. And what worked for Esther works for us. And we all deal with hard-hearted people every day of our life. You know, the king was hard-hearted and Esther had to deal with him. Haman was hard-hearted, Mordecai had to deal with him, the Jewish people had to deal with him. In our lives, we can deal with hard-hearted people. We can deal with people that are full of darkness and always trying to do bad things. But yet when we read the story of Esther, we see that it doesn't matter if it's a king, it doesn't matter if it's one of the king's helpers, it doesn't matter who it is. God can soften those hearts. God can move those people out of the way. And when you read the story of Esther, I think the overarching theme that you see there is that there's hope. There is always hope. When we are born again, children of God, there's always hope. As long as you're in the center of God's will. As long as you're serving God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength, there is always hope, no matter how dark it gets. And so Esther's story, even though it's an old one, it's a story that lives on for us today. And it's about how that God steps in. And even when it looks like evil is going to win, God always puts things right. He's never late. Sometimes it seems like he delays answering our prayers. I think we've all experienced that when you just say, Lord, I really wish this had been done like 3 days ago or 2 weeks ago or a long time ago, because I'm a very impatient person and I tend to tell God, I really wish you'd get this done. Sometimes it seems like God delays, but God is there working. And we talked about that I think last week, how that God is always working, even in the stillness, even in the quietness. Even when it seems like you can't hear him or you can't feel him, God is always working. And that's where our hope is that we know that God says he would never leave us. He would never forsake us. He would be with us to the very end. And so we hang on to that hope. And that is the light that we see in the darkness. And I think about Esther and how when the king talked to her and Mordecai, and he said, this is what you need to do. This is the new law that you need to write. I can imagine that when she heard all of that joy and all of that happiness across the entire city of Susa, in which the scripture says that it was in every province and in every city as the news spread, there was just one great big celebration for all the Jews. There was singing and there was music and dancing and laughter. And all of those hard hearts had been softened. All the danger had been taken away. And that last part of the last verse of that chapter says something that I had never seen before. It says, and many among the peoples of the land became Jews. There in Persia, they were pagan worshipers. They had just conquered the Jewish people and took them in to their country and took all of their wealth and all of their land. The Jews were just captives there in the land of Persia. But because Esther stood for what was right, because Esther was willing to put her life on the line, because Mordecai was willing to put his life on the line and not bow down to Haman and not give in to all that was going on around him. When God began to move and God began to work, and the Jews saw God's hand release them from this death sentence, and they began to rejoice, and they began to worship, and they began to praise God, and they began to laugh and to share and to rejoice, that reached out and touched all those people who were around them. They saw what was happening in their hearts and in their lives, and they turned toward the Lord. You know, when we rejoice instead of complain, people pay attention to that. When we give God the glory for what he's done in our life, sinners perk up, because you know what? They need Jesus. They need that hope. When we share all the good things that God has been doing and how he blesses our heart and our soul, people who are discouraged, people who are depressed, people who feel hopeless, they're like, that sounds pretty good. Here in the land of Persia, when the people of God began to just rejoice and worship the Lord, those Persians turned toward God. They began to worship the one true God instead of all of their pagan gods. And I think we can learn a lot from that. And that night, I think as Esther returned back to her room in the palace, in her mind she probably was tired. She probably had been, you know, when you've been running on adrenaline for so long and you've been pushing and pushing and pushing, when you sit down, you're like, you're tired, but it's a good kind of tired because everything had changed. Everything had changed in the whole land of Persia for the Jews. And it changed because Esther did what needed to be done. She did the hard stuff. She ignored what the rules were. Nobody was supposed to approach the king unless they'd been called, but she did because she knew it was so important. She ignored the rules. She interrupted the king in his room. She learned to wait until it was the best time to say what she had to say, because she could have said it there when she went into that throne room the first time when he extended the scepter, but she didn't. She knew it wasn't the right time. She said, no, I just want you to come to a banquet. Haman and the king came to the banquet. And the king said, what do you want? But she knew it wasn't the right time. And she said, I'd really like for y'all to come back tomorrow. And I'd like you to have a second banquet for you all. See, she learned to wait until God said it was the right time. Esther also boldly stood against wickedness, and she was able to look Haman in the eye, the one who could have caused her life to come to an end. But she stood face to face against wickedness, and she exposed Haman and exposed his cruel plan. You see, the devil doesn't have power when we stand in the power of God before him. And Esther also pled for her people. And God heard her cries. God heard her prayers. And he saved the people of Israel and caused the king to tell them how to change the law, to change the rules so that the people of Israel could be saved. Esther did what was right. And because she did what was right in the streets, she could hear her people rejoicing. She could hear the singing. She could hear the dancing. She could hear the music. And that's why the scripture says, for such a time as this was Esther born to be the queen of Persia. And for us, for such a time as this were you born to live in this place, in this time, doing what God has called you to do, because nobody else can do what you're doing right now. Nobody else could do what Esther did. Nobody else could do what Mordecai did. God called them in that time to do that work. God's called you in this time to do your work, to do what he has laid on your heart to do. So we have, in the book of Esther, we have one more chapter. Actually, there's two chapters, but we'll roll it into one next week, and we'll finish out the book of Esther. Now, do you have any thoughts or questions or comments about this 8th chapter of Esther. You can turn that off if you want.